But I will say the positives, Julia Jones' character is capable and strong. She doesn't need a man or the help of a man, aside from a very specific scene where she asks Dexter for help. But she figures out Dexter's a Bay Harbor butcher. Like that's awesome in itself. She's a prop. She isn't sexualized in the show. And I thought the show also did a great job of incorporating MMIW. It's a cause that is very specific to Indian country. It's talked about in Indian country a lot, but outside of Indian country, it's not mentioned. Wind River, the film Taylor Sheridan film, they made an attempt to talk about MMIW, but they didn't do a good job. You know, they brought it up and, oh, look at these poor people. They don't have the resources. They don't have the ability to solve these crimes. They didn't even give the opportunity to call it out what it is, MMIW. It was right in front of their faces and they never even said it. But they did in Dexter New Blood. And I like also how they juxtapose the level of effort that's exerted when it comes to looking for non-native people and native people with Matt Caldwell. You know, Abraham earlier in the show is like, hey, when it comes to this Caldwell kid, the whole town shows up. But when it's one of our girls, it's like, oh, it's just another runaway. The runaways always come back. You know, she'll be fine. And in episode 3 specifically, another positive that I had was, and I mentioned this earlier, is the ritual, the ceremony. It's all off camera. It's all away. Nothing's explained. They don't even try to explain it. And I really like that because as Dexter and Audrey and Angela, they're all sitting at dinner with Harrison, talking about, hey, release that white deer back to the people so they can do something with it, so it can go home, so it can go where it's supposed to be, which is on its homeland. I like that as they're about to explain, because Angela Bishop's like, okay, so what are they going to do with it? And Audrey's like, okay, so what they told me was, and as they're about to explain in detail what they're going to do with it, it fades to an inner monologue from Dexter. And so they talk about exactly what they're going to do with the deer, but none of it is on camera. None of it is heard by the audience. And after they're done talking, Harrison's like, hey, Dad, we can use your truck, right, for what they talked about? And that is very tasteful. That is very graceful. That is one of the best things possible. I feel like most non-native run shows, they would have tried to do something. They would have tried to like figure out what we would have done on our own, and maybe would have asked like one native person and said like, hey, does that sound right? All right, we're going to go with that, and then butchered it. But they didn't. And I really like that. They just said like, hey, I don't know what we would do and nobody knows what, so let's just leave it alone. You know, they're going to do their thing. We're not going to be a part of it anyway. So let's just let them do their thing. And I really like that. That was one of the most graceful things ever. Another positive is Caleb Abrams. They had a Seneca consultant on the show. And while I would like it for it to be the effort put forth further or earlier in the show, like either on the production or the have a writer, a native writer on the show, you still had a cultural consultant who was actually Seneca on the show. And he told me nothing but positive things. He told me like, hey, when I got the script, yes, there were a lot of work. Yes, there were a lot of changes, but they put in their work themselves. They did homework themselves as a showrunner, as a non-native group. They did the labor themselves. And I really like that they put that work in there to make Caleb's job easier, but also to make the finished product look better. The language use, another positive. I really like it when the language use is just 0 subtitles. Something I didn't know I needed until recently. If you've seen Reservation Dogs, when Muskogee was spoken, no English translation. It's just like, it's almost like a mixture of English and Muskogee, where it's like the audience has to figure it out. But you don't have to figure it out because the director does a good job of leading you along the way to know like, oh, they said I love you. Even though there is no subtitle below, like, hey, we said I love you in Seneca. Because the person says, oh, I love you too, in English on the way back. And so you're like, oh, okay, I see. And this was done with Caleb Abrams' help, with a Seneca consultant, because they know that that's how people talk. You know, that's how we talk, like natives in general. Like English is so much a part of our everyday speech, more so than our native language a lot of times, that it's just a blend a lot of times. And I really like that. You know, just like if my grandma was like, hey, yeah, it's Eshiaj, and I was like, hey, good morning, grandma. And like, it would just be that easy. You know, it's like, hey, grandma, how you doing? Like, I would just acknowledge her that way because I would understand. And I really enjoyed that. Seemingly like a nothing interaction to a lot of people, a lot of non-native people. But for me, who's seen that kind of crap butchered, where you get the Indians speak, or you have to like over dramatize, or you have to like romanticize the the translation and make it seem like, oh, we're always talking about sunsets and rising suns and how many moons ago that was, or how many moons ago this was, how many generations forward we needed preserving this. And it's like, no, it's like we just say regular words like I love you and hello, and sometimes we don't use our own language. I really like that. There was diversity in the natives. Here's another positive. Some men had long hair, some of them didn't. Some of the women were of size, some of them weren't. Some spoke Seneca language, some of them didn't. Even in the way they looked, like not everybody, if you saw those, if you lined up all the native people, all the native characters in the show, you would have maybe picked out a few that look native. You know what I mean? That kind of have like the stereotypical, they have long hair, especially in the men, they have long hair, they look a certain way, they fit the bill that we've been fed. But no, it was very diverse. Everybody looked different, and that's how it is. Most times I get mistaken for Hispanic or Filipino, but I'm Navajo, and that's how native people look. We just look all over the board. But I think because of how we've been portrayed, one, stereotypically in like mascots and in Hollywood, but really it's like the message, the way that we've been fed of like, oh, the leather and the feathers, men have long hair, and women have certain features that need to be that are sexualized, and oh, look at their hair, look at how pretty it is, and blah blah blah, flowing in the wind like Pocahontas, or they always got to be wearing jewelry. Yes, I'm wearing jewelry, but it's just a coincidence. We don't always wear jewelry. But typically that's what happens, is like, hey, let's make sure we put a hat with a feather on this person, or let's put a beaded vest on them so the audience knows that they're native. It's like, no, in this show they were just regular people walking around, and that's what we are. And non-native run shows are getting better at that. Grey's Anatomy, for all of my criticism on their tradition episode, they did a good job of just presenting native people for how they look. Same thing with Resident Alien. They do a bang-up job in that show, and I encourage everybody to go check those two out. And I would say the last positive that I talk about with Angela Bishop's character, she's a badass. I mean, she captured the Bay Harbor Butcher. It was a woman, a native woman, that did this. So she was not helpless. She didn't need the help of somebody. While that is a positive,